Have you ever thought that a small, almost invisible piece could solve a mystery that no one else could decipher? That's exactly what happened to me with my most difficult case. We had only a bone fragment, a tiny piece of bone, and yet there was the key to finding the truth after months of disappearance and silence. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It all started in Santiago, when a small box arrived at our desk with that fragment inside. The police were out of leads, the family desperate, and the case seemed doomed to be just another of the many that remain unanswered. But for me, the truth was right there in that tiny piece. My name is Dr. Leonardo Mendez from the National Institute of Forensic Sciences, and what I'm about to tell you is no ordinary case. It wasn't the size that mattered, but the detail that bone held. The person behind that bone disappeared without warning, with no clear witnesses. The pressure was enormous because each analysis could be the last hope for that family. We couldn't fail. What seemed absurd at first, a simple piece, began to reveal secrets no one suspected. But how can such an insignificant piece say so much? That was the mystery. I set out to use every available technique, from microscopic analysis to genetic comparison, searching for answers in every millimeter. As I progressed, I found layers of information hidden in the fractures, in the bone's composition, all telling of lifetime and difficult pasts. The science that to many seems cold, in this case was a direct bridge to the pain and hope of a family that just wanted to know. And just when it seemed everything was lost, that fragment gave me an incredible clue, something I did not expect to discover, and that changed the course of the case completely. What made this case special was the way that small bone spoke for itself. It was not just a meaningless piece. It was a silent witness. In each analysis, I understood better the story behind the disappearance, and when I could finally reconstruct the identity, it was a blow of reality and relief for everyone. And yet, with the truth in my hands, the question remains, how many truths stay buried because no one looks closely enough? This case taught me that no matter how fragmented the evidence is, there is always a story waiting to be told. You just have to know where and how to look. And that was the hardest and most valuable lesson this investigation left me. I didn't just find the truth for one case. I learned that in the small can lie the biggest things we can discover. Can you imagine how many more fragments we haven't known how to see? How many cases are out there waiting for someone to give them the chance to speak? So now you know, don't underestimate the small nor confused silence with lack of clues. Sometimes right there in that tiny space is the truth that can change everything. This fragment gave me more than answers. It gave me a question I still want to keep exploring. And that's why I believe this was, without a doubt, my most difficult and at the same time, most revealing case. Want to know more about how a bone can tell a complete story? Tell me in the comments what you think. And if you have any case or mystery you'd like me to analyze, we're here, still searching for truth in the places no one looks. When I finally received that bone fragment in the laboratory, I remember feeling a strange mix of frustration and a slight glimmer of hope. It was just a small piece, almost microscopic, nothing that usually appeared in regular searches. It might have seemed like an insignificant remnant, something many would dismiss without giving it the proper attention. But for me, there was something more there, a story to discover, a truth waiting to be freed from that tiny trace of life. The first thing was to examine it as delicately as possible. The fragment was not only broken, but had very subtle signs of wear and marks that, to the untrained eye, seemed irrelevant. However, I had already learned from other cases that every scratch, every crack, could tell an important part of the story we were looking for. I started working on the reconstruction under microscope, observing those lines, those tiny signs of a level of concentration that, truthfully, worked almost like meditation. That was when I understood that not every truth is revealed at first glance. The truth hides, it conceals itself in details, and often only shows itself to those who take the time to see it. Days turned into weeks, and those weeks into months. I never felt I was rushing the process or wanting to skip steps because I knew time was on our side in cases like this. Rushing could mean losing something irreplaceable. But also, amid the patience, moments of tension and doubt arose. What if all this time I was just seeing onion skins? What if behind that fragment there was no story, just a dead end? It's something you can't help but wonder when faced with such deep uncertainty. Then, little by little, and when I least expected it, I began to notice a pattern. A type of mineral structure in that fragment suggested something more than common human remains. The composition and certain chemical anomalies led me to propose that it belonged to a person who had been exposed to very particular conditions, not just after death, but for a prolonged time in life. That small bone didn't just speak at the end, but also the path that person had traveled. To be honest, that changed how I approached the investigation. It was no longer simply about identifying a name or reconstructing a biology, but about delving into a life, because that particular exposure, that chemical mark, spoke to me of someone who had lived in a very specific environment. It was as if, suddenly, that fragment gave voice and told me secrets that no one had heard before. So I decided I had to cross that line between science and empathy, between cold data and human understanding. Finding background information was complicated. When the agency responsible for recording disappearances handles thousands of cases, many get piled up and details are lost in yellow papers. But every small clue I found was examined with the same meticulousness as the fragment. I spoke with relatives of the missing who refused to give up, with police officers who had poorly organized old files, with neighbors who remembered vague dates, with any spark that could make the story emerge from oblivion. Every account, no matter how confusing, helped build the puzzle. There were doubts, of course. At one point, a test I did to cross initial genetic data seemed not to fit the early indications. It was a hard blow because I felt everything could crumble again, but just when frustration threatened to take over, I thought of repeating the analyses with more advanced techniques recently implemented in our institute. It was a risky bet because not many believe in the power of review, but that's how research goes. There are no absolute certainties, only hypotheses subject to evolution. The results confirmed the unthinkable. The fragment matched a person reported missing almost 3 years ago, someone who had been practically erased from the routine and daily memory, but who had never stopped being sought by their family. At that moment, I understood that not every small fragment is insignificant. That little piece of bone represented persistent hope, a thread of light in the darkness. It was a revelation that gave me back the energy to move forward even more. From there, the case took on a more human than scientific dimension. I visited the family, talked to them, listened to their story, their pain, and their undying hope. It was an encounter that touched me deeply, because deep down we all know that behind every piece of data, behind every analysis, there's a life worthy of respect and a truth-seeking justice. That first contact reaffirmed to me that my work was more than forensic. It was being a bridge between silence and memory. At the same time, complications arose. Some elements found in the analysis revealed that not everything about the disappearance's environment was so clear or clean. There were signs of negligence, perhaps even complicity. The fragment, small as it was, led us to discover a web of cover-ups no one had suspected. Actors inside and outside institutions were reluctant to cooperate, creating a permanent atmosphere of tension. I felt the weight of responsibility and also vulnerability. Sometimes science crosses paths with politics and interests separate from human pain. In those moments, every step forward cost twice as much, but the chain of evidence grew. The lab results, the statements we obtained, and confirmed story began to form an increasingly clear picture. We even managed to identify not only the missing person but circumstances explaining their prolonged absence and the reasons for so much silence. It was a mix of relief and sadness that dominated my emotions that day, because answers were coming, but so was the weight of a truth no one wanted to accept. Now, thinking that such a small fragment could lead us to so much truth made me wonder how many other fragments, other pieces of human stories, have been lost because no one knew or wanted to look with the same attention. Because truth doesn't always shout loud enough for us to hear from afar. Sometimes, as in this case, the truth whispers from the tiniest corners, from a perfectly unexpected shadow. Perhaps that is the greatest difficulty and also the greatest lesson. Not to judge the small, to learn to listen to what seems irrelevant. Every time I think about that case, I feel again the pulse of that silent search, of the patience necessary to plant certainty where there was uncertainty. And although we helped that family find closure, to see their peace restored, I also carry that persistent echo. What else might remain hidden in fragments that will never be in our hands? What stories lie asleep forever, waiting for a patient observer to give them back their voice? I don't know if we'll ever know, but as long as there are fragments to study, I will tell their stories. Because in each one there is a truth that deserves to be found. That fragmented truth, so fragile and vital at once, is the engine that drives my work and the reason why I never let a small remnant go without the attention it deserves. Because in forensic science, as in life, sometimes you have to look very close, almost touch the invisible, to discover what changes everything. What followed that discovery was an unexpected mix of progress and difficulties that made me understand even more deeply the complex nature of truth. Because science, however rigorous, does not move in a straight line. It is more like a mighty river that winds its way through time. Sometimes its waters flow quickly and clearly, and other times they stagnate in dark pools where nothing seems to advance. That's how I felt during those months. Trapped between a hope brought by a small bone and the silent walls of a system that often seemed to conspire against the truth. I clearly remember the first time the family came to the Institute. It was not a formal or cold visit, but rather a meeting full of restrained emotions and looks that said everything without the need for words. The mother, with tired but firm eyes, handed me a faded photo and spoke of her son as if she could still hear him by her side. At that moment, I understood that beyond my technical role, I had become a bridge between that profound loss and a world that sometimes refuses to see. For them, the truth was not just a scientific result. It was a possibility of closing an open door and reopening the path for mourning and healing. As I tried to consolidate the case, details began to emerge that complicated the story more than I had imagined. On one hand, there was incomplete documentation, missing or altered files, and on the other, contradictory testimonies that made it difficult to build a linear narrative. That bone fragment not only spoke to me of a person and their environmental exposure, but seemed to whisper hints of something darker, invisible to the naked eye. I began to suspect that behind that disappearance were interests that someone very powerful wanted to keep in the shadows. It was then that I found the first crack in the wall. Reviewing the initial police reports, I noticed that certain names and places appeared and disappeared at will, almost as if someone had tried to erase clues. I tried confronting some involved professionals, but was met with silence, evasiveness, or worse, evasive glances that reminded me that in cases like this, the truth can be dangerous. However, it was not time to back down. Every fragment, every small chemical or genetic piece of evidence we obtained in a lab, was a seed of hope that pushed me to continue. Subsequent analyses identified traces of chemical substances indicating not only prolonged exposure to toxic environments, but also the possible presence of remnants of specific medications not recorded in official medical records. Something didn't add up. How had that person received that treatment? Who had decided to administer it? And for what purpose? These questions led me to explore the social and work environment of the missing person. I discovered he worked in an industrial zone with harsh and poorly regulated environmental conditions, but also had indirect ties to sectors of local power that prefer to look away from certain facts. In parallel, the analytical techniques had to evolve to face new challenges. We implemented a method of high-resolution microscopy and spectrometry that allowed us not only to identify chemical elements, but also infer biological processes in the bone, such as toxin accumulation during life. We found that the fragment had suffered metabolic alterations caused by a contaminated environment, reinforcing the hypothesis that the missing person had been exposed to more than just harsh working conditions. This generated new lines of inquiry. Was this a long-term environmental accident? Or was it part of an intentional cover-up, where the harm caused of this person was a sign of more serious violations? We had to request permits to collect samples from the place where the disappearance was assumed to have occurred. Thanks to a committed team, we accessed a range that had been partially closed off for previous official investigations. The process was tense. Some responsible parties seemed more interested in obstructing than cooperating, and there were moments when I felt an almost palpable presence of surveillance. Every step was taken amid a charged atmosphere, as if something invisible wanted to prevent the full emergence of the truth. But there we were, holding a silent struggle with the conviction that no fragment, no matter how small, should be left aside. The results on the ground were revealing. We found remains of hazardous materials, mainly heavy metals, that matched the chemical anomalies in the bone fragment. We also discovered evidence of unrecorded human presence, such as fire remnants and personal objects not reported in early investigations. All this allowed us to reconstruct not only the death of the missing person, but also the days preceding it, full of abandonment, vulnerability, and perhaps fear. At that moment, the scope of the case changed radically, because those traces did not only speak of negligence, but a system that had failed the one who needed its protection most. As we delved deeper into the story, an unexpected twist appeared. An anonymous informant, aware of the barriers we faced, decided to send documents directly linking state officials and local businessmen in a web of corruption that affected the safety and transparency of the area where the person had disappeared. There was talk of deals made in the shadows and bought silences so that certain truths would never see the light. It was hard to assimilate, but it was tangible proof that the fragment in my hands was much more than a bone remnant. It was the tip of the iceberg of a much larger problem. This revelation opened some doors and closed others. On one hand, we received firmer support from certain authorities who could no longer ignore the case, but on the other hand, the pressure increased. I had to face not only scientific adversity, but also veiled threats and the emotional toll of being caught in an invisible war mixing justice, power, and fear. More than once I thought about resigning, letting the case rest in oblivion to protect my peace of mind. But the image of that family, waiting without losing hope, kept me firm. As we progressed, the investigation began to change lives. The family, once consumed by uncertainty, found in each result a reason to stay strong. Seeing them gradually recover the dignity and memory of their loved one made me realize that my role went beyond the scientific. I was a custodian of fragmented truths that, once assembled, could transform pain into justice. At the same time, I began documenting everything with extreme rigor, anticipating that the case could become a symbol, an example of the struggle between invisibility and the need for recognition. One of the hardest moments was when we presented a preliminary report that directly pointed to concrete responsibilities. The reaction was immediate. Some voices rose to discredit our work, question our methods, and try to sow doubt in the process. It was a painful chapter because although one expects resistance when truth is uncomfortable, it's still a blow to see how science itself can be challenged by vested interests. During those days, the pressure became almost unbearable, but fortunately I had the unwavering support of my team and the scientific community that understands the pursuit of truth is a path that admits no step back. Patience and methodological rigor, however, began to bear fruit. New complementary analyses reinforced our hypothesis, and territorial findings were confirmed by independent expert reports. The courts called hearings. Previously frozen cases were reopened, and society at large began to become aware of the magnitude of the problem. It was incredible to see how such a small fragment could unleash a chain of events that not only restored a name to the collective memory, but also pointed to ways to prevent future tragedies. But, as often happens in these cases, every answer brought new questions. What other disappearances had been lost in silence? How many times had the truth been tortured until it turned into a shadow? I thought of those forgotten fragments, those cases archived without further investigation, and the answer was not simple. Truth is not a static object. It is a river that needs to be constantly fed by attentive eyes and the firm will of those who refuse to accept opacity. It is a call to all of us not to let indifference bury the stories that still deserve to be told. Amid all this process, I experienced a profound personal transformation. I learned that science alone is not enough. It is essential that behind every piece of data, no matter how small it seems, there is humanity, empathy, and courage. Because behind those fragments I analyze, there are people who suffer, families who wait, lives that deserve respect and justice. That blend of technique and sensitivity is what gives all this work meaning, making every night in the lab and every setback worthwhile. Today, when I think of that fragment that seemed insignificant, I cannot help but feel admiration for what it managed to ignite. A relentless search, a waking of memory, and a profound demand for truth. It is a constant reminder that no corner is too small to be explored, nor a story too fragmented to be reconstructed. Because after all, what we do is not just forensic science. It is returning a voice to those who can no longer speak, lighting the darkness with the faint lights of hope and challenging indifference with the power of knowledge and justice. And although the journey was hard and full of obstacles, it is clear to me that every step taken was necessary. Every repeated analysis, every difficult conversation, every emotionally charged visit was worth it, so that the family could finally rest in the certainty of knowing what happened to their loved one. And for me, that closure is only the beginning, because now I know there are many more fragments out there, waiting to be heard, and I will not rest until each one receives the attention and care it deserves. In that commitment lies the essence of my vocation, and the driving force that will continue to propel my work day by day. The atmosphere in the laboratory grew thick with barely contained tension. Each new piece of data seemed to raise more questions and answers, as if the bone resisted revealing everything it held inside and at the same time was practically screaming for justice on behalf of someone no longer there to defend themselves. There was something about that material fragility that, ironically, bore an almost unbearable weight, like a silent and stubborn witness refusing to be ignored. The deeper we delved, the more I felt this case confronted us not only with death, but with an entire web of silences and complicities stalking us from the shadows. We pressed on despite obstacles and warning glances that, more than once, made my pulse quicken and my mind waver. But that doubt was precisely what drove me to double my efforts, because I understand that truth is not just a fact to be discovered, but an act of courage sustained by perseverance. So we kept crossing boundaries, meticulously examining every micrometer of bone matter, every particle that could shed light on the story presented to us incomplete and distorted. We introduced new techniques, some even unusual for our institute, and thanks to that innovation, we managed to reveal microscopic marks that indicated not only the life of that person, but also the invisible wounds the environment had inflicted upon them during the months or years prior to their disappearance. The idea of reconstructing an identity under these conditions was like assembling a puzzle with hidden or falsified pieces, while at the same time dealing with the pressure of reality where those who should protect and seek justice seemed more interested in safeguarding their image or keeping secrets under lock and key. I remember one particularly cold morning when, after weeks of almost no progress, a small finding of bone pigmentation gave us a momentary hope. That strange tint on the bone's surface, almost invisible to naked eye, suggested contact with a specific chemical, something unusual for the area, something that connected us directly to the industrial center where the missing person worked. It was a tiny but conclusive trace. One more piece of evidence adding weight to our suspicion that their disappearance was not the result of just any accident. Armed with that information, we turned to another important source, interviews with indirect witnesses. At first, these testimonies were fragmented and often contradictory. But with patience and more patience, I began weaving patterns that started to outline a more complete picture. Some accounts hinted at the presence of organized groups monitoring and controlling the area. Others spoke of furtive encounters at dawn, and little by little, an atmosphere of widespread fear emerged. People speaking in hushed tones, as if uttering a name or simply recounting what they had seen, would unleash silent threats. This complex social layer was as overwhelming, if not more, than the technical aspect of the case. I realized that in facing the truth, I was not only battling the darkness within the bone, but a much deeper fear entrenched in that community. One of the harshest episodes occurred when a close colleague alerted me to an apparent sabotage attempt. Some laboratory equipment had been tampered with, and preliminary data had mysteriously disappeared. It was not just a technical failure. It was a clear sign that someone was willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth from coming to light. Paranoia settled among us, and we had to take extreme measures to protect our samples and ensure every step was recorded and unbreakable. This climate of distrust added emotional pressure to an already complex scientific and human process, and more than ever, I understood that we were in the middle of a minefield where success depended not only on science, but also on our integrity and courage. Yet, despite all this, there were moments of unexpected beauty. I particularly remember the day we managed to link the bone fragment genetically with the family who had entrusted us with their pain. It was a silent but intense moment. While reviewing the results, I felt that all the months of work, effort, doubt, and fear condensed into that small yes. It was not just a scientific confirmation. It was an act of justice that returned some hope to a family who had long been navigating the dark ocean of absence. I saw tears, hugs, and silences that said everything words could not. This experience reaffirmed for me once again the true dimension of our work. Behind every lost fragment, there's a world of lives deserving to be recognized and honored. However, each breakthrough awakened new questions, and as the truth emerged, it also spread like a stain illuminating forgotten areas and problems that went beyond the individual case. Signs of systematic institutional negligence appeared, unreported abusive labor practices, and a culture of silence perpetuating injustices. But we also discover human faces willing to break that wall. Dissenting workers, local activists, small and concrete voices that, despite fear, decided to bet on the truth. Their testimonies filled us with energy and determination while revealing social wounds that had to be exposed, not only for justice in our case, but as a warning to prevent similar situations from recurring. As the case gained greater notoriety, our meetings became a space where science and ethics intertwined without losing balance. We discussed strategies to present evidence so that it could withstand not only technical scrutiny, but also political and social attacks. We understood that what was at stake was much more than a file. It was a challenge to structures seeking to keep certain secrets buried. The weight of commitment was overwhelming, but also liberating. Once we left fear aside and focused on a purpose, the will to continue became indestructible. One morning, after receiving a new batch of analyses, everything accelerated. The results were conclusive. The bones contained clear and specific traces of a compound which, according to experts in environmental toxicology, was not only lethal in the long term, but also used in clandestine industrial processes with a lamentable history in the region. The impact of this discovery could not be underestimated. It was undeniable proof that the missing person had not only been a victim of a negligent system, but also a collateral damage of illegal and hidden practices. The problem escalated. It was no longer just an isolated case, but the visible tip of an iceberg affecting an entire community and reflecting a deep and resilient web of corruption. The release of these results was met with an unexpected mixture of support and resistance. Some sectors began mobilizing to demand answers, while others once again tried to discredit the investigation with tactics that only revealed a concern about the impact the truth could have on their interests. It was a critical moment, the point where science became a social catalyst, and since then the connections between public health, labor rights, and justice could no longer be ignored. Previously invisible parts of a painful reality began to take shape, and that meant it was also in our hands to promote real change. But not all was an open fight. At times, the emotional toll was such that I felt trapped in a maze with no way out, where every mistake or stumble opened the door to the fear that everything might be lost. There were nights when I reviewed the data by the glow of the computer alone, in absolute silence, wondering if I was doing the right thing, if the truth we sought would be worth the personal and professional cost. It was in those moments that the image of that family reappeared in my mind, with the determination in the mother's eyes and the silent waiting of the siblings, reminding me that behind every fragment were lives deserving of that relentless effort. That certainty was a flame lighting my steps in the shadows. As the judicial process advanced, the pressure increased. Some nights I felt fear, not for my own risks, but for the possible setback it could mean for the family and all of us who had bet on the truth. Meetings with lawyers, preparation of expert reports, and coordination among various agencies became an exhausting but essential marathon. Meanwhile, the community began organizing, driven by our work, to demand fair labor conditions and reparations for environmental damages never officially recognized. It was impressive to see how a bone fragment had managed to move so much, how the combination of science, truth, and courage could become a driving force for hope and collective commitment. In the outcome of this process, there were no easy, happy endings, but a path toward reparation where every advance was celebrated as a small but solid victory against injustice. Today I can say that the fragment that came into my hands was the beginning of a story that transcended my work as a forensic scientist to become a symbol of resilience and dignity. I cannot deny that wounds remain open and the struggle continues, but I know that the noise of that bone, once silent, has now become an echo no one can ignore, and it is in that echo, in that constant reverberation of intertwined questions and answers, that we find the heart of our task. Because truth, in the end, is not revealed in great blows or a single instant. It is built with patience, with risks taken, with the conviction that despite the darkness, every fragment deserves to be heard. The bone spoke to us, and we responded. Now it is up to society, institutions, and all of us to keep that conversation alive, to protect those voices that are often silenced, and to keep seeking without rest or fear the truth that saves and transforms. That is the deepest lesson this case left me. That science must always be accompanied by humanity and courage, that justice cannot wait, and that even in the smallest and seemingly insignificant pieces, there beat stories capable of changing the course of many lives. Because, at the end of the day, we do not just restore names to memory, but build the foundations of a future where truth, though fragmented, is always the light guiding our path. And even if that task seems endless, may we never stop paying attention to those ignored fragments, because within them lies the possibility of a fairer, more humane, and truer world. That discovery about the chemical compound in the bone set everything in motion with unexpected speed and intensity. However, far from simplifying matters, it opened a Pandora's box that no one seemed prepared to face. The magnitude of the web of dark interest beneath that industrial zone was overwhelming. What began as an individual case, a bone fragment that held a story, transformed into a spiderweb woven with threads of power, fear, and corruption. No matter how much I tried to remain calm and scientifically focused, that bird was present at every step, nesting in every analysis, in every word shared with the team. Attempts to discredit our work became increasingly evident and subtle at the same time. Comments in the Institute's corridors, or even in spaces I believed safe, were clear signs that certain people were uncomfortable, that they preferred that story to remain silent. But the most unsettling thing was a sensation, almost tangible, that the close watch on us went beyond casual interest. There were anonymous watchers, doors closing when we entered, important meetings excluding us, clearly aiming to control the narrative. At times, it seemed to me that small bone fragment, which had landed almost by accident in my hands, had become a time bomb, an incandescently dangerous truth. Despite this, the determination of the team and me grew stronger. Moments of discouragement were balanced by confidence in the evidence and commitment to the family awaiting justice. Science had become both a shield and a sword. Every confirmed datum, every method applied, and every verified result was also a blow to those who wanted to keep the veil of opacity intact. The entire investigation was a chess game with invisible pieces, strategic moves on a seemingly endless board. Hours in the laboratory blended with conversations with lawyers, journalists, and activists who became unexpected allies, refreshing our perspective and reminding us that this case echoed throughout the community. It was precisely during one of those informal meetings, as we reviewed the latest results, that an unexpected turn surprised us. Among the samples we analyzed, signs of a new contaminant agent were found, one not detected in initial studies. The most baffling thing was that this agent had a chemical structure that did not correspond to anything officially registered in the region, but, according to information from reliable sources, was linked to clandestine operations apparently protected by influential sectors. This heightened our feeling of touching an open wound that few were willing to reveal. It was not just a case of negligence or accident, but the direct exposure to a system mixing economic interests with the systematic neglect of life. The weight of this new information permeated every subsequent meeting. Strategies to present these data had to be carefully devised to protect everyone involved, from the family to the closest collaborators. We also understood that for our investigation to have the necessary impact, it had to be articulated from a multidisciplinary perspective, bringing voices from public health, environmental law, and community sociology. This is how we began building bridges with academics and organizations that, like us, felt the urgency to make visible those invisible damages, those social and institutional wounds often buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and apathy. Amid this complex web, a key testimony left us breathless. A former industrial center worker, protected by anonymity and visibly affected, recounted episodes that expanded the tragedy to unforeseen levels. He denounced habitual practices of hiding workplace accidents, subcontracting personnel without adequate protection, and maneuvers to conceal dangerous environmental exposure data. This account not only confirmed many of our hypotheses, but also humanized even more the harsh reality that bone fragment represented. It was an urgent call not to let those voices be silenced, a painful reminder of how dearly people paid for silence imposed from above. From that moment, the investigation took on a dual character. On one hand, we continued the forensic analysis, which kept enriching itself with new techniques and repeated reviews to ensure absolute rigor, as if that fragment still had secrets to reveal. On the other hand, the social dimension became inescapable, forcing us to confront directly the structures that had allowed so much harm and, at the same time, seek ways for the community we were addressing to claim dignity and recognition. It was not an easy process. Tensions grew with each report published and every step taken toward the truth. Several times I had to make difficult decisions, always prioritizing ethics over comfort or personal safety. I especially remember one of those long nights in the laboratory when we received the latest results showing the presence of highly toxic industrial compounds, not officially declared, at levels exceeding any known standards. The screen illuminated my face, and as the excitement of scientific confirmation ran through me, I felt the enormous responsibility such findings implied. I knew it meant long-awaited justice for the family, but could trigger an earthquake for the authorities and businessmen involved. Despite that burden, I understood that freezing was not an option. That moment marked a turning point. Science was no longer just a means to discover what had happened, but a tool to transform an unjust reality. As the investigation progressed, community solidarity also intensified. Civil entities began organizing forums, marches, and awareness campaigns that brought together diverse voices around a common cause. Slowly, the truth we had deciphered from that bone fragment emerged from invisibility to the center of public debate. However, alongside this visibility came veiled threats. On more than one occasion, I received anonymous messages and warnings reminding me that opposition remained active and that, for some, the truth was an unacceptable risk. It was then I deeply understood what it means to be a custodian of truth. Your commitment can put you in a line of fire, but that same courage is what can make a difference for those without a voice. This experience taught me that every step forward is a battle won on rugged terrain, where patience is as essential as precision. Days filled with small victories, such as confirming a fact, securing authorization for more sophisticated tests, were celebrated with the intensity of monumental wins, because deep down we knew that to achieve justice, evidence alone was not enough. Persistence and the ability to sustain the narrative when everything seemed against us were also necessary. And there were moments when that reality manifested forcefully: administrative delays, attempts to divert media attention, even mistrust within the team generated by exhaustion. However, the look in the eyes of a mother who could finally mourn her son with true certainty was the strength that kept everyone firm. On the other hand, the complexity of the case pushed us to constantly review our methods and touches, ensuring that no loose ends or doubts could be exploited to discredit the investigation. It was a constant learning process, a difficult balance between scientific rigor and the human dimension that charged everything with meaning. It was not only about clearly identifying causes or criminal interventions, but also translating that knowledge into messages that could reach different audiences, respecting the emotions involved, and generating an inclusive process that transcended the purely technical. I realized that my role was not only that of forensic doctor, but also a bridge between science and society. One of the most heartbreaking moments was when we had to communicate to the family, in person, the definitive genetic confirmation. Although they already knew or suspected many details, facing the truth in that intimacy was an act of humanity that touched me deeply. The mixture of gratitude, relief, and sadness on their faces reminded me that, for them, this story was not just a laboratory case, but a piece of their life that finally seemed to have closure to begin healing. It was also a reminder that behind every fragment, so small, so fragile, lies the immensity of human pain and hope. Meanwhile, pressure from various fronts never ceased. The judicial process was undoubtedly one of the most challenging chapters. Every ruling, every testimony, and every report submitted was ground that had to be carefully guarded to prevent outside interests from distorting the truth. Interaction with lawyers and prosecutors allowed me to observe another dimension of the fight for justice: The need not only for technical evidence, but also for strong and consistent narratives that could withstand the ebb and flow of political and legal arguments. Science became an underlying truth, but also an ethical reference point, a pillar upon which a coherent and powerful discourse could be built. What I did not expect was the impact this investigation would have on the community. What began as an individual search for justice became a social catalyst that sparked a silent movement. Demands for stricter regulation, better working conditions, and environmental transparency gained unprecedented strength, transforming the political and social landscape of that region. I was impressed by how from one fragment emerged a collective that broke inertia and proposed profound change. That was, without a doubt, another of the most valuable lessons. Science, when embraced with humanity, can also be a beacon guiding social transformation. But despite progress and visibility, I cannot deny that persistent shadows remained, memories still inhabiting delicate and painful spaces. Unanswered questions, wounds left unhealed, and the certainty that many other similar stories could be ignored, floating invisibly in some corner of time and oblivion. This feeling, far from being paralyzing, became a silent engine to keep opening paths, to never cease the constant search for those fragments that tell more than they appear and which, if given a chance, can reshape the present and future. Now, looking back and thinking over this entire journey, I can say that small bone, which initially seemed an almost insignificant enigma, was much more than an object of investigation. It was a key, an invitation to look closely, listen attentively, and reflect on what justice and truth mean in a world often blind and deaf. I remain convinced that although the struggle is complex and sometimes painful, the commitment to truth is the path that saves us, makes us more human, and connects us with the history and destiny of those with so little to defend themselves. And that certainty, which I have silently learned in every analysis and every encounter with those who trusted us, is what I want to share. Truth does not always come wrapped in headlines or grand revelations. Many times it arrives in tiny fragments, in almost imperceptible details, but rich in meaning. That is why if we learn to look with patience and courage, if we open our ears and hearts to those echoes, we will find it is possible to build a future where justice is not just a word, but an everyday reality. Because truth, in the end, lies in the small things, in the details that at first glance we wish to ignore, but that bear the weight of human dignity. And the challenge we all have, scientists, institutions, society, is to be attentive to those fragments, to those voices that even today silently call to be heard. The pressure was mounting, not only because of the growing public attention, but also because each breakthrough in our work made it clear that we had uncovered something much deeper and more dangerous than we initially imagined. That small bone evidence was, in reality, barely a window into a tangled system, a dark web where loyalty to the truth clashed with relentless interests and structures that have been sustained for decades under protection of silence and indifference. And although we knew that this battle would be much more than scientific, we felt ready for whatever came, because it was impossible to turn our backs on what that family, that community, and that fragment were demanding from us. Weeks passed during which the laboratory became our refuge and at the same time, a battlefield. Data collection was intense, incorporating techniques that had only been used in cases that were too complex or had far greater resources. Every analysis was accompanied by long and meticulous debates with the team. What conclusions could we support with absolute certainty? How will we present that evidence before the courts? And what impact could it have on the community and local politics? During those days, it wasn't only the microscopes that were active. Constant surveillance, encrypted communications, and meetings in secure locations became routine. There was an inescapable weight in knowing that, on the other side, there were watchful forces willing to do anything to silence the truth that was slowly being exposed. But it wasn't all tension and exhaustion. There were moments with colleagues who generously contributed creative ideas to overcome technical and legal obstacles. I remember that one of our young interns proposed a procedure to detect minimized traces of heavy metals, a technique that opened a new line of research we hadn't considered at the beginning. That small contribution ended up being key, revealing the magnitude and persistence of environmental contamination at levels even worse than those reported. It was a definitive proof supporting the deepest suspicions. The tragedy we were investigating was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a systematic chain of negligence and irresponsibility affecting many more people. with devastating consequences for public health. Meanwhile, we continued gathering testimonies, many of them painful and courageous. Those anonymous accounts were like pieces of a puzzle trying to assemble the everyday reality invisible to those outside those communities. A woman, mother of one of the workers who had died years before, revealed to us how, after her son's disappearance, she received no official support and how rumors and fear kept people in complicit silence. Her trembling but firm voice reminded us why we were there. Not just to judge a forensic case, but to honor those lives and bring light to places where there were often only shadows. One of the hardest nights for me was when we received an anonymous message containing crucial information, with documents showing maneuvers to divert attention from cases of occupational diseases linked to exposure in that same industrial zone. Despite the obvious risk of documenting ourselves with something that could be part of a larger operation, we decided to review everything very carefully and corroborate every piece of data. The work led us to connect fragments that until then seemed unrelated. Ignored complaints, missing files, altered reports. The corrupt network became more visible and painful, but also operable because truth was its most vulnerable strength. In every meeting with the family, I sensed how the bond between that deep sadness and contained hope was strengthening. When we shared progress, their questions sought not only information, but also signs that this terrible cycle might come to an end. The responsibility, I felt, was immense. I could not limit myself to being a distant technician or scientist. I was the one carrying the voice of that reality, demanding justice now, not in some distant future. I knew that every mistake, every doubt, every fragment not interpreted with precision could mean another loss for them. As the case's visibility increased, so did the hostility. There were moments when, leaving the Institute, I noticed cars that seemed to follow me in social media messages aiming to discredit our work, planting the idea that the investigation was conspiracy or set up to harm vital economic sectors. However, far from intimidating us, those attacks strengthened my certainty that we were hitting a sensitive nerve, that science, in its purity and honesty, was the most powerful weapon we had to dismantle a system built on lies. Amid all this external pressure, I was also concerned about the team's well-being. The burden was heavy, and more than once anguish and exhaustion slipped out. There were nights when uncertainty and frustration dragged us down, and we wondered if we really had the strength to carry on. But in those dark hours, we found strength in unity, in the shared conviction that that small, silent fragment had much more to tell, and that we were the ones responsible for doing it justice. The laughter shared between stress and coffee breaks became small anchors that kept us steady, reminding us that truth was also a human task, born of commitment and genuine affection. As we progressed, the landscape began to change slowly. The first judicial hearings were a key moment where scientific evidence and human testimony intertwined to show a devastating but undeniable portrait. The presence of the team in those rooms, the precision of the reports, and the restrained emotion with which we presented each finding were a declaration that justice could make its way, even though the path was full of thorns. Some judicial decisions began to favor the cause, and public opinion was divided between those demanding concrete changes and those still defending the status quo. The social impact was enormously gratifying. Citizen campaigns began to emerge. Community dialogue spaces and environmental monitoring committees were created with experts and activists. People gradually regained their voice and right to demand transparency and protection. Universities, journalists, and international organizations got involved, and although the threats did not disappear, the case's visibility became the best shield against opacity. It was a moment when I felt that science, ethical commitment, and collective strength could truly change things, even when they seemed invincible. Nonetheless, recognizing that mobilization did not exempt us from meticulous work, which had to continue relentlessly. New analyses, new data comparisons, stronger regulations for forensic handling, and constant advice on how to protect witnesses and participants occupied us for months. Each phase was a test of endurance and adaptability, where technical demands combined with a human dimension from which we could neither escape nor wanted to. I understood that our role had many faces. We were scientists, advisors, watchdogs, and, above all, people deeply committed to ensuring that every fragment of that story was heard and respected. I remember a particular emotional meeting with the team after submitting a report that showed not only a pattern of industrial negligence, but also the presence of banned chemical elements affecting new generations. There was silence, exhausted faces, but also a renewed determination. And in that silence, I realized something fundamental. We were not alone in this fight, invisible to many but decisive for others. We had turned a forgotten fragment into a symbol. And, without a doubt, that was the deepest and most hopeful lesson I received. And even today, when I close my eyes and mentally review that entire journey, I am amazed at how such a tiny object can hold such great power. Not only because it revealed a hidden truth, but because it opened the possibility that others, elsewhere, may also find hope in their own stories. That was the true victory of that small bone. To remind us that truth, no matter how fragmented and abandoned it may seem, has the power to heal, transform, and, above all, dignify. I know there are still paths to travel, many other fragments waiting to be discovered, and many voices that still need someone to listen to them. But I also know that as long as there is someone willing to look closely, with patience, respect, and courage, truth will never be far away or indifferent. And that is the certainty I want to leave with you, because it is a call not to overlook the small signals, the forgotten clues, those silences that hold stories that deserve to be told, and, above all, recognized. Because in that act of listening and constant searching lies the most authentic hope, the one that can change not just a case, but an entire reality that we often prefer to ignore. So when someone tells you that the truth is uncertain or that a fragment is not enough to understand, remember this story. Remember that sometimes the smallest pieces hold the greatest secrets, and that, to find justice, you need to look with the heart as much as with the mind. After all, that is what humanizes us and keeps us steadfast in the search, no matter how difficult the path. And that, my friend, is a truth no one can ever take away from you. But just when we thought the case had reached a critical point, reality surprised us once again with an unexpected twist. Amid the most thorough analyses and clandestine meetings, a new clue emerged, a second bone fragment, found in a different location and separated in time, but with genetic characteristics that seemed to link it to the first. That piece, tiny and worn by time, forced us to rethink the entire investigation. It was not just an isolated case or a single act of negligence. It was the tip of a much larger iceberg of ignored tragedies and corrupt systems that had left a trail of victims over the years. That confirmation put us once again under a tension that seemed unbearable, but it also strengthened our commitment. This was no longer just a search for individual justice, but the collective voice of silence that had lasted too long. As we worked to integrate this new evidence, a restlessness arose within the team, something that gradually became an invisible driving force. What else were they hiding from us? We began to investigate archive records, to talk with experts in toxicology, environmentalists, and doctors, and to analyze patterns that went beyond the forensic limits of our usual niche. The case became a complex web, where every thread we pulled brought us closer to a network involving public and private entities, responsible for policies and practices that had compromised the health and lives of entire communities. We may have started with a bone fragment, but now we were facing a systemic phenomenon, an open wound that needed to be exposed in order to heal. The hardest part was facing the fierce resistance, an almost religious denial of those who felt threatened by that truth. Legal pressures, misinformation campaigns, veiled and overt threats. There was no strategy they did not try to use to stop us. But with every assault, the team remained steadfast. There was something beyond every protocol, beyond every technical report, that sustained us. The human connection with those who awaited answers. It was a mother who embraced a fragment that represented a piece of her son with tears. It was a brother who searched for us at every contact with trembling hope. It was a community that came out to demand, with a tired but determined voice, the right to live without fear or toxic waste. That was what made our task transcendental, impossible to abandon. It was during one of those long nights of work, when the darkness outside seemed like a mirror of inner uncertainty, that a discovery once again changed the course of the investigation. The most sophisticated analyses revealed biological traces indicating not only exposure to contaminants, but also the presence of toxins linked to clandestine medical treatments used to silence occupational illnesses. That connection between forensic science and illegal medicine showed us an even darker dimension. Lies intervene not only by negligence, but also by deliberate intention to hide truths through methods beyond the law. That discovery left us stunned and with a renewed sense of urgency. Our work was now crucial, not only for justice, but also for public health and human dignity. That fragment, which began as a mundane object on a laboratory board, had become the beacon illuminating a network of complicity and silences with deep roots. The magnitude reminded us of the fragility of justice when it is not upheld by the scrutinizing and unwavering gaze of those unafraid to investigate the hidden. From that moment on, the team abandoned routine to adopt an almost obsessive pace, combining the most advanced science with the tracking of social and legal leads. We cannot allow such a truth to vanish due to bureaucratic issues or fear. Every analysis, every meeting, every covert phone call or track file was a battle won against a century-long absence of justice. What initially seemed like a technical and quiet investigation transformed into a public crusade. Soon, community groups found in our work a scientific foundation that legitimized their historic demands. Together, we managed to turn the imposed narrative that of simple accidents or natural deaths into a denunciation against irresponsible practices and corporate defenses that denied the obvious. The family's face regained in those moments a glimpse of hope that, although fragile, grew against all odds. I cannot deny there were moments of doubt, when sleepless nights weighed heavily, when media storms hit hard, or when fear of possible failure trapped us. But those would have been the ideal moments to give up, and we resisted. A turning point came when the first judicial rulings began to set clear precedents, establishing not only individual responsibilities, but also instituting stricter protocols for environmental protection and monitoring in the area. It was a victory we hoped for, but also a sign that the struggle had to continue, because true justice is a process, not a final act. What we had learned through hard effort is that those fragments, so many invisible and silent in countless cases, not only tell individual stories, but, when read with proper patience, reveal patterns that can change entire realities. It was a triumph for science, for social commitment, and for human dignity. And it was not just about technology and analysis. It was a collective exercise in humanity. Those nervous laughs in the lab, the silent embrace after an exhausting session, the firm word in the courtroom, the understanding look for those afraid to speak. All of that completed the mosaic we built with each fragment and every act of courage. Along the way, I understood that science, however exact, always needs soul and commitment for its value to transcend. And that was what inspired the team to keep going when logic dictated otherwise. Today, when I think about that case and the small bone that triggered everything, I feel that piece not only bequeathed knowledge, but also a collective responsibility that persists. There are many other stories waiting to be told, many other silences to break. The truth is, sometimes truth is hidden in tiny vestiges that seem impossible to interpret, but it only takes looking at them with the courage of truth for them to become an unrelenting beacon against the darkness. That is a true lesson that case left me, that the word end is never valid when we talk about justice and dignity, that the path only begins when we believe we have reached the destination, and, above all, that the strength of fragment is as powerful as the human will that defends it. So I want you to hold on to this idea, my friend. No matter how small or insignificant a clue may seem, there is always a universe hidden in those tiny pieces. Truth is not only sought with instruments or calculations, but with a commitment to listen without prejudice and to persist when all seems lost. The story of that fragment is also the story of every person who dares look beyond, to refuse false imposed truths, and to believe that even in the deepest shadow, there is always a light ready to illuminate the way. Keep that light alive, because you never know when it might be the only hope for someone waiting to be found.